Great. So hello, everyone. So my name is Thomas Ash. I'm an economist and researcher at the UCLA Anderson Forecast. And so this is the latest edition of our podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to kind of pull back the curtain, if you will, on some of the interesting academic research that's being done, and to cover some issues that are important for kind of the business community, governmental community, and otherwise. So today I'm very excited to welcome a researcher whose work I greatly admire, Lint Barrage. He's an associate professor and chair of energy and climate economics at ETH Zurich. She holds a PhD from Yale, and she has a really interesting body of work on the macroeconomic impacts of climate change. So that's something we're going to get into in detail today. So welcome, Lint.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the macroeconomics of climate change. We're going to touch on kind of climate change in general. We're going to talk about some of the fiscal costs of climate change, which is kind of a subject that's not talked about enough, really. And we're also going to potentially talk about some issues related to green innovation and green innovation policy. And to the extent we have time, we're going to then talk about some of the estimates of the macroeconomic impacts of climate change in general. And we may get onto some other topics if we have time. So to start off, I mean, climate change as a topic doesn't really need too much of an introduction. Obviously, it's something that's talked about quite a lot these days. And obviously, we're talking about this at a time when a lot of records are being broken around the world. We're at a time when there are a lot of heat waves. A lot of people are discussing this in the media and in the news. One stat that actually surprised me quite a lot was that apparently in Delhi in India, there was a record broken most recently for the highest minimum temperature. So obviously it's quite common to talk about maximum temperatures, but actually in Delhi, India, the highest minimum temperature for several days was broken where the temperature didn't fall below 35 degrees C, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. And you can just imagine the conditions for temperatures to be that high constantly. You know, there's no reprieve at night. So that's one thing that really just shocked me recently, but these kind of stats are not uncommon. And so against that background, I thought it'd be interesting to start with, you know, what brought you into climate change research and why do you think it's so important?
Yeah, I had the great fortune at Yale to work with William Nordhaus, who is, of course, the economist who pioneered the introduction of climate change into macroeconomic analysis and modeling, actually in the early 1970s, long before there was an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and we were having these kind of discussions and awareness that we do now. So I had the incredible fortune to work with him and two other advisors who also were doing work on climate change. And that's what brought me into this particular focus. What's important to me is for us to have a better understanding of how climate change is affecting and going to affect the macroeconomy. And that's because only when we understand the mechanisms can we think about whether we can mitigate any of these impacts. The other thing that's very important to me in this literature is to better understand what kind of policies or private sector efforts can be successful in mitigating carbon emissions. Which is, of course, something that many researchers and policymakers have thought about for decades now, but it's really a moving target. The policy landscape, the politically feasible set of policies, everything is a moving target, so we have to stay on the ball, essentially. And the third reason why I think economics is such a valuable way of thinking about climate is because it forces us to think about trade-offs. Right? Every coin has two sides. Everything we do or do not do has both costs and benefits. And economics forces us to think about both. And, you know, I, as a researcher, have devoted my professional career to environmental and mostly climate issues. I think it's one of the most important challenges humanity faces. But it is not the only challenge that we face, and our resources are limited. So I think an economic framework where we think about the trade-offs carefully is a very important part of the discussion.
Yeah, great description. And as you said, it's a good justification for economists getting involved in climate change. Obviously, a lot of people think it's primarily or purely a scientific kind of field, but there's very strong reasons for economists to get involved in understanding climate change too. So that's great. And one thing you kind of touched on was the importance of the macroeconomics of climate change. So obviously for listeners that are perhaps less familiar, in economics, there's a division between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and that exists in the field of climate change also. So there have been microeconomic researchers that have examined, there's a whole list of them now. There's the impacts of extreme heat on test scores, on agricultural yield. There's even a growing body of literature, I think pioneered by Marshall Burke at Stanford, who examines the effects of climate change on conflict. So there's a lot of these different micro fields of study. But sometimes I guess the macroeconomics of climate change can be a little bit less talked about. So macroeconomics tends to focus on the broader, more aggregate picture at the whole country level. And so your work specifically focuses on, well, not specifically, but a lot of your work focuses on the macroeconomics of climate change. So I thought it might be good to hear a little bit about why you think the macroeconomics of climate change especially is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's really two elements to the answer. The first is the importance of the macroeconomy itself. And in a way, it goes without saying, but I also think we can't overemphasize how essential the macroeconomy is for standards of living and human well-being. Right. So Robert Lucas, a Nobel Prize winning macroeconomist, the late Robert Lucas, famously said, once you start thinking about economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else. And that's because when we look around the world and we see such vast differences in the standards of living of people across the world, right? Why in Burundi over 60% of the population still lives on roughly $2 a day or less, and then you have other countries that are extremely fortunate. Why? Why are some countries growing and others not? It's such an important question. Again, it goes without saying, but we also can't overemphasize it. Even in economies that have had the good fortune of growing and are matured and developed, macroeconomic stability is so important, right? When we think about recessions or threats to that stability, if we think about the financial crisis, Great Recession, there's such suffering associated with that. People losing their jobs, people losing their homes, people losing a lot of their wealth, their retirement savings, their earnings potential is potentially affected for the rest of their lives by having been out of work or starting the workforce in a recession. Their children's school outcomes, it's so fundamental to our experience that I think, again, it's just essential that we understand the macroeconomy and protect it. So that's the importance of the macroeconomy. The other aspect is I think it's important to bring a macroeconomic perspective to climate change analysis. So this is more methodological, but I think it's also relevant. And here's where I actually think micro and macro complement each other a lot. Right, the micro helps explain the macro. We see GDP is affected by various weather events. Why? What are the mechanisms? Again, we have to understand the mechanisms to find a remedy. Macro can also help us think about all these different micro estimates. What do they add up to? And how do we think about the spillover effects between them? Right, so microeconomic analyses, they're often very carefully done to demonstrate an effect that we can give a causal interpretation. It's not just a correlation. We know with reasonable confidence that X caused Y and how big Y was. That's invaluable, but it doesn't answer every relevant question. And when we think about spillover effects across markets, across populations, then we need to zoom out to a more macro perspective to think about what that might be. So one example that might be useful is more on the mitigation side of climate change. But when we think about the shale gas revolution in the United States, this is one of the biggest changes to global energy markets in the past decades, right? The United States, thanks to breakthroughs in the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracking, started producing massive amounts of natural gas from shale deposits and has become the world's #1 producer and exporter of natural gas. This is a huge change in energy markets. What are the effects? Is that good news or bad news for the environment? Right? So from a microeconomic perspective, we might do things like, and many researchers have done, very careful analyses using microdata of electricity generating plants around the US to think about, well, if there's a price shock, how is the emissions profile of these different plants affected? And then we can measure in the data what actually happened. And those studies have often found that emissions intensity of US electricity generation decreased in the short run because of the shale boom. Substantially, say around 10%. This is because a lot of power plants were switching from coal to natural gas-based generation. So that's good news. And we see it in the data. I think there's something very satisfying about a research result that comes from the data, because you're like, well, that happened. Modeling answers perhaps a broader set of questions, but again,
Right.
it doesn't, but it's an essential piece of the story, because then from a macro perspective, we zoom out and we say, okay, that happened at the micro level, but what else might have happened? What are the spillover effects, the long run effects? How might this shale gas revolution have affected incentives for investment in new generating capacity of different types? Where if you think about it through a macro model, you would expect that it slowed the deployment of renewables. How did it affect the macroeconomy? We would expect cheaper energy helps us grow. That's, of course, a good thing, but it increases the scale of demand for energy and potentially greenhouse gas emissions. Doesn't mean growth isn't good, but it's just something to think about. We also find, so this is based on joint work with Philippe Aguillon, Doron Arjimoglu, and David Hemou, that if we think about the private sector's decisions of where to focus their efforts on technology development and innovation, how has this shale gas revolution affected the profits of, again, pushing on different technologies? And what we would predict through the model, and what we actually see corroborated by patenting data, is that incentives to innovating clean technologies were reduced by cheaper natural gas. It's not just the US, that's also around the world. In general, countries, when they see a decline in natural gas prices, holding many other things constant, then on average see declines in patenting for clean versus fossil electricity innovation. And this makes sense, right? If you have a cheaper substitute available, then there's less urgency in developing new technologies. From a macro perspective, we can then simulate or project all these different forces together. What are the net effects and how do they change over time? In a macro model, we can also do counterfactual experiments. What if we had done this policy, or if we had done this differently, what might have happened differently? It is a model. It's a model-based projection. It makes simplifying assumptions. There's many caveats, but what we find is that in the short run, the boom increased growth and decreased emissions, but in the long run may have well increased them and continue to increase them. So we need to think of an appropriate policy response to harness the potential in the shale boom to make the clean energy transition cheaper. But we have to proceed with care. It is a model projection, but again, I think this is where the complementarity between micro and macro is really helpful.
Right. And I think that's a great description, really, because often, especially in academic economics, micro and macro can sometimes be seen as substitutes to some extent. But I think, as you say, in reality, often there's a very strong complementarity between the two. And in some sense, it's kind of like looking at the same coin from different sides, which can really help us understand what's really going on, what's the bigger picture, what's the more detailed picture. Both are very important. So that's a great answer. So, I mean, one thing that I think we wanted to talk about, and that is obviously also an important area in macroeconomics, is fiscal policy. So for those a bit less familiar, perhaps fiscal policy is part of macroeconomics that's concerned with government spending, and government spending choices on anything from roads to healthcare, and to specifically in this case climate change related spending like climate defense, or other things that might affect the economy from climate change. And so you have some important work looking at fiscal policy with climate change, and also the fiscal costs associated with climate change. And this is part of a body of work, I think, that you have looking at some of the things that are perhaps missing from climate change research, and kind of adding those in a very diligent way, which I think is great. I was wondering if you could talk us through your paper on the fiscal costs of climate change. How do you think climate change will affect the costs incurred by the US government?
Yeah, I think it's, as you said, it's one of the more underappreciated potential mechanisms that's important, not just for the US, but for emerging markets, for a lot of countries potentially around the world. We don't know enough about it. So conceptually, Thomas, you already gave some great examples, but there's a number of mechanisms through which we might think that climate change could affect public budgets. So climate change can affect the cost of existing public programs, right? If more people use healthcare services who are on public insurance as a result of a heat wave, that's an increase in public health expenditures as a result of, say again, a heat wave or a hurricane. Increases in extreme weather will necessitate increases in fire suppression and disaster assistance, etc. So costs of existing programs might be affected. The revenues that we collect from different taxes might be affected by changing climate. If sea level rise depresses property values, property taxes may change. Or if climate change affects labor income, labor tax, all sorts of mechanisms through which revenues could be affected. As you said, also, we may need entirely new government initiatives and programs for adaptation investments, such as large coastal protective infrastructure projects. There's also broader effects. Climate change may affect our demographics by changing migration, where people live, the demographics of the population through also premature mortality, which affects social programs and tax bases population. So there's really many mechanisms, and we don't understand enough about these various impacts. There are, however, a number of micro studies that have started to tackle these channels, and this is a great example of where in my own research, I looked at all those micro studies and put them in a macro model to think about what does this all add up to, right? And so what the results suggest, I should say those have not been peer reviewed, this is a working paper, but the estimates right now suggest that already, as of the year 2026, climate change is costing US taxpayers at least $88 billion per year. And what is 88 billion? Well, to put it in context, it's about half of US government expenditures on military personnel in fiscal year 2022, or roughly on par with the budget of the Department of Homeland Security. That's a combination of foregone tax revenue and increased expenditures, but healthcare accounts for the plurality of it. Mm-hmm. So how is that big or small, right? It's kind of a, still a question. And I think in the context of the US fiscal outlook, it looks modest right now, but relative to our understanding of what the economic impacts of climate change for the US might be, it's very large. So if we add this, which people might be surprised to hear, fiscal impacts and their associated macroeconomic effects, such as if I have to spend more and collect lower tax revenue, I have to either increase taxes or cut other expenditures or add to the debt and incur higher interest payments, right? Something's got to give. And there's a macroeconomic cost to that. So once we model those effects and incorporate these expenditure increases, my estimates of the overall economic costs of climate change for the US economy increase over previous studies by about 25 to 33%. So it suggests that our previous understanding was a substantial underestimate and that these fiscal impacts add non-trivially to the economic cost of climate change. I should also say that in both several studies by other researchers and some other work I'm doing, financial markets are starting to respond to these fiscal risks. So there have now been several studies that have looked at municipal bond markets in the US, for example, finding that sea level rise risk appears to be already capitalized in long-term municipal bonds to some extent. So municipalities that are more exposed to sea level rise risk, all else equal, have higher borrowing costs or higher borrowing costs, all else equal, than municipalities that are less exposed. There's now some other work in progress by some authors looking at heat, and I have some work with Wing-Chan Zhong and Kieran Walsh, also at ETH, looking at wildfire risk to communities in the US, and we also find quite substantial and increasing capitalization of wildfire risk increases into municipal bonds. So financial markets are responding, and there's just a growing evidence base pointing us towards this as an important impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's extremely important, I think. And I think pointing out that financial markets are starting to kind of take notice, already have taken notice of some of these things, and also that it's not all fully capitalized necessarily also. And so I know you have a paper where you look into flood risk perceptions and show that it's to some extent capitalized in house prices, but perhaps not all. So maybe this is kind of a natural segue, since you mentioned that, to just talk about housing a little bit. I don't know if you want to just give a few of the kind of notes from that paper, because I think people are very interested in housing markets and how they might be affected by climate change too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And housing is another thing that's so important both to the macroeconomy and to people's retirement savings. It's really important that we have an eye to the housing market. So a quite broad literature that has already worked on this for many years has kept finding that current flood risk, flood zone status, does not appear to be fully capitalized into housing prices in the US on average. So what does this mean? When we look at, for example, two houses that are otherwise identical and they're right next to each other, one is a little bit more elevated than the other, and one thus has higher flood risk than the other. One is in a FEMA high-risk flood zone and the other is not. We would expect that the more at-risk house sells for a slightly lower price. And this price difference to the identical home with it's the same except less flood risk should reflect, for example, the present value of insurance costs, right? Because if you're in a high-risk FEMA flood zone, you have to have flood insurance if you have a federally insured mortgage. But we don't see the value of, say, or the costs of insurance or the expected damages on floods over the course of a 30-year mortgage. On average, how much damage would you expect from flooding? We don't see those full costs capitalized on average. We see costs substantially capitalized for for homes that are investment properties. So it's owner-occupied homes where we don't see it. We see differences in capitalization across markets that believe more or less in climate change. So there's all sorts of heterogeneity. But the bigger point is, on average, we're not fully capitalized. Now, what we did in this particular study with Laura Backenson from the University of Arizona is we went door to door in Rhode Island and talked to people both that live in high-risk flood zones and their slightly inland neighbors. And it was a survey that asked about all sorts of housing market opinions. We didn't want to prime people by saying flood risk, but we just asked them, among other things, how concerned are they about a flood affecting their home in the next 10 years? What do they think the probability is? Again, we talked about fire and other things too. And what we found is that the people who live in the high-risk homes, the majority of them tell us on a scale of 1 to 10, they are not at all concerned about flooding affecting their homes. Whereas their inland neighbors that live just slightly down the street, just slightly further elevation, say they would be, the plurality says they would be very worried about flooding if they lived on the coast. So we see that people seem to sort who chooses to live on the coast. Well, holding all else equal, people who are less concerned about risk. Of course, people also differ in their valuation of the view of the coast, right? So we take that into account too. We estimate that for every person, because one thing I'll say, to be honest, when I was looking at this sort of in theory, I was saying, why are people buying in this flood zone? This seems crazy. And then I went and it was so pretty. And I may have looked on Zillow a few times myself. So it's the amenity value is important to consider.
Right.
But we did. And again, we see this sorting. Now, why is this important? First, housing is not like other financial assets. There aren't the kind of arbitrage opportunities where if one market participant sees a mispricing, they can short the asset and kind of help prices reflect fundamental values more. It's not the case in housing. And so if the people who are buying the homes are disproportionately not concerned, if they underestimate true flood risk, then the prices of those homes are above the fundamental value of the home. Why is that a concern? Well, at some point, if that bubble breaks, someone is going to absorb that price correction, right? So someone is going to have to suffer those consequences. And that's just a concern. It also gives poor incentives for development, right? Developers, if I can fetch the high price on the home, regardless of whether it's high risk or lower risk, and of course, different communities have rules about development in risk areas, but on average or in general as a rule, if the prices aren't right, the market can't get it right, and incentives are going to be off, and we're going to adapt less. So there's risks of price corrections, there's risks of misdevelopment, and that's why this is something to be concerned about.
Right. And I think that's great. I mean, like you said, it's often we cite these numbers that are often kind of averages or the average market price, but actually there's a lot of heterogeneity there that's very important to coming up with that kind of average number. So I think that's very important to point out, and I thought your paper did a great job of doing that. And maybe just to bring it back quickly onto the sort of fiscal policy side, I think one part of what you were just discussing that's important for fiscal policy is the notion of kind of flood insurance programs. I guess that's something that's talked about a lot on the fiscal side of things related to housing. And so do you have a perspective there on public insurance to sort of help people that find themselves in that predicament? I think what you're suggesting is that there may be some big disaster-related costs for people that are not fully pricing in the true risks of, their home getting flooded.
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult issue, actually, because with the stroke of a pen that changes the flood zone of a property or the flood insurance price, you can take away the value of someone's house. That's their livelihood, that's their retirement savings. And so for people who are potentially affected, this is a huge issue, which makes this such a thorny issue to correct. The theory of what the efficient price would be is one thing, but there's real people and their livelihoods at stake, which makes this a difficult issue. I think from the fiscal perspective, in my fiscal cost estimates, I actually did not consider potential debts incurred by the National Flood Insurance Program. So the National Flood Insurance Program is it's a public program that's the dominant insurer against flood risk in the US. And it had a history of long subsidizing a lot of flood insurance policies by up to 45%, so quite substantial subsidies often. But FEMA has phased in a new pricing 2.0 policy that's going to align or geared to align insurance rates more with properties' actual risk. And so to the extent that that's successful, we would expect less of a fiscal shortfall from the National Flood Insurance Program in the future than maybe we've seen in the past, where both the rates were not aligned with risk, and there's also shockingly low participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, despite mandates and despite subsidies. So I think the future of NFIP is going to likely look different than the past has. NFIP, right. Sorry, National Flood Insurance Program.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, as you said, that's one thing that often shocks me to hear, that the take up of such policies is so low, given the importance of these things, like you said, to people's house prices and to their livelihood. So one thing that I think would be useful to touch on as well is the interaction between the optimal carbon policy, if you like, which might involve a lot of different measures to incentivize the mitigation of climate change, and how that interacts with fiscal policy. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on what is the sort of optimal carbon policy response given fiscal policy, because the linkage between those two is often not discussed.
Yes. I love that question because I wrote my dissertation on that topic. So it's been on my mind for many years, and many researchers have studied this exact question for many years, actually. And that's in part because the answer is surprisingly nuanced or surprisingly complicated. And I think a lot of the research focuses on carbon pricing policies, could be taxes, could be emissions trading schemes, but some of the lessons hold more broadly and would hold for the kind of subsidies. There's lessons we've learned about clean energy subsidies, like we're seeing now with the IRA, and some of the lessons also apply to regulations or clean energy standards. So I think there's some broad lessons that we've learned in the literature. So you can think of these impacts and interactions, it's like an onion. You peel back the different layers. So the first layer is the direct fiscal impacts. If you have a carbon pricing policy like an emissions trading scheme with auction permits, that raises revenues. Or you have a tax, the tax raises revenues. If you have a subsidy policy, that costs fiscal resources. That's the first layer. Then you peel back the second layer. Well, if I impose a tax, I'm increasing energy prices, and somewhere in the economy, we would generally expect that to decrease investment or employment, at least in the short run, right? Of course, ultimately, hopefully, we're doing the policy in a way that will increase the scope of the economy in the long run, but at some point, somewhere, there's going to be likely a reduction in employment or investment, right? These are the costs of the clean energy transition. that's going to decrease the revenues I collect from that industry or in that location, the tax revenues I collect, all else equal. So there's already a difference between the gross revenues raised by, say, a carbon tax and the net revenues after I take that second layer into account. And then there's the opposite for a clean energy subsidy. Yes, it's costly, but it stimulates the economy. It's going to stimulate investment. We've seen this with the IRA. That by and of itself, all else equal, is going to increase the size of the economy, the tax base that will raise some revenues. So already there's these two layers. Then I go to the next layer. Whatever the net effects were, on net, I got some extra money. On net, I had to spend some money. What fiscal adjustments am I making to compensate for that? Right? So if on net I raise some revenues, do I send it to households as a check? Do I use it to extend corporate income tax cuts? Do I spend it on some new initiative? What do we do with the revenues? Again, on the subsidy side, if I need some extra revenues, do I just borrow more, issue more debt? Do I raise certain taxes? What do I do? That's the third layer. And then whatever that is going to have an effect on the economy again, right? If I do corporate income tax cuts, then maybe that stimulates some investment, which all else equal will increase tax bases again. If I send people checks, maybe that affects what they buy, their labor supply, could be all sorts of things that affects tax bases. So I've lost track. The next layer. And then there's yet another layer of what are the environmental impacts of the policy? If we're making a dent against climate change, these fiscal costs we talked about before, we can avoid them. So that in the long run is going to save us some expenditures and increase our revenue. So there's all these different layers to the problem, to the question, which is why so many people have been thinking about it for so long.
Right. Yeah, that's a great answer. And I love the way of conceptualizing that with the different layers of the onion, because obviously this is one of the things that macroeconomics can excel at times, which is thinking through all of these different economic linkages, of which there can be a large number, like you said. So conscious of time, I do just want to come on to clean innovation a little bit and talk about that. And this is something you've been working on more recently. And so obviously, economists talk a lot about carbon taxation and that being kind of the optimal way, carbon taxation or cap and trade as being the optimal way to deal with the climate change externality, if you will. But typically that tends to be pretty unpopular. And so we tend to look around for other alternatives. And like you said, the climate change policy landscape is quite a dynamic, moving environment as new alternatives are thought about. It's quite a lively area. And so I wanted to just come onto this, and I know you have some recent work where you look into clean energy and innovation, and particularly the importance of path dependence. But maybe you could start off by just explaining what path dependence is here and why it's relevant, and also just more generally, what is the right model to think about green innovation and green innovation policy? That's a big area, but
I actually no, it's a big question, but the answer is easy. I don't think there is a right model. Every model makes some abstractions and has some advantages, and we need those different perspectives to complement each other. So I think we need all hands on deck, scientifically speaking. So maybe if I may first just say, I actually disagree a little bit with the premise, or I would characterize the premise of the question differently. I don't view clean energy innovation subsidies as a substitute for carbon taxes. It's a mission critical complement, right? Whatever regulatory or cost increasing policy we have to have support for clean tech innovation more broadly. And that's because it's in economics, we talk about externalities. Do the incentives that individual market participants face capture the cost or value to society of what they're doing? Of course, if I go and I fly on a plane, I don't have to pay for the cost that my emissions cost to the planet. That's why we would ideally like to have something like a carbon tax. But also, if I invent a better solar panel, the benefits from that are generally much larger to society than the returns to the inventor. And that's one of the reasons we need subsidies for clean energy innovation, and large ones. Most of the modeling suggests we need way larger subsidies than we currently So I think it's a mission critical complement. And that's not just true from sort of a theoretical economic discussion of the incentive problem, but if we just look at what we need to do or want to do with the clean energy transition and the net zero by 2050 goals, it's going to require vast advancements in technologies, right? So most of the net zero scenarios foresee quite rapid and substantial deployment of technologies that are now at a relatively early stage. Carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, widespread use in industry, transportation as a storage fuel. So innovation is mission critical to getting the job done, which is why these subsidies are important. Now, to the question of path dependence, so what are incentives for innovation that exist in the marketplace? Because most R&D expenditures in the US economy come from the private sector. The government does some subsidies, but most of it is the private sector. So what's the incentive structure? And the idea of path dependence is that, well, technologies that are more advanced often can be more attractive for additional improvements, right? So if I gave you, if the innovation fairy comes to you and says, I can give you an idea for a patent that will improve the efficiency of the typewriter or the iPhone, which would you choose? You would probably choose the iPhone because there's a massive global market you can sell into, right? And so if we have fossil fuel technologies that are widespread, they're globally used, then if you can improve the gas turbine, you're going to have a pretty big market to sell into. So the idea of path dependence is that, success can build on itself in technological development. And so then the market forces left to themselves might just incentivize the market to keep its focus in the fossil technologies. You need something to shape the market in a different direction and do it sufficiently far that the success of clean tech, can start to build on itself. So that's the importance of path dependence, which again highlights not just the importance of innovation subsidies, but the importance of timely action. Of course, have been mission absolutely essential to the development of the global economy, to the prosperity that we have. We owe that to the energy fuels that we have been using, but there needs to be a change into the future, and that's going to require innovation, and we need that innovation support.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's kind of one of the very interesting things that comes out of the paper, which is that doing it sooner is actually optimal, which is not necessarily true for all types of climate change policy, but really with innovation subsidies, ASAP is better. Right. So just very quickly before we wrap up, one of the important parts, as you mentioned, of the macroeconomics of climate change has been William Nordhaus's great contributions on integrated assessment modeling. And so this is something he's been working on for a long time, and what's referred to as the DICE framework, which is stands for, correct me if I'm wrong, Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy model.
Model of climate and the economy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so that's something that he's been updating for some time and using that to create estimates of the impact of climate change on the economy, and in particular, quantifying the linkages between the two, because there's kind of an important feedback there. This is something recently that you and William Nordhaus updated. And so I was wondering if you could take us through what you found from that update, anything that's different from in the past, and generally anything you think is important about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been one of the greatest honors of my career, that I've had the opportunity to work with Bill on this update. And the main changes we made to the model include the following. So we updated the representation of the carbon cycle and the climate system. And that's because, science keeps progressing in our understanding of the climate, and how we can represent it succinctly, in small enough ways for economic models, keeps changing. And so we updated that aspect of the model. We also updated our quantification of climate change impacts, of the costs and opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So previous versions of the model focused on just industrial CO2 emissions, but in fact, land use-based CO2 emissions and non-CO2 emissions, be it methane in agriculture or chlorofluorocarbons, those are potent greenhouse gases, and there's some opportunities to reduce them also, some low-hanging fruit that we don't want to ignore. as well as some other maybe more technical updates. And the results, I think the key results are that I would highlight are maybe twofold. So the first is that there's an enormous gap between the stated international policy ambitions for, say, limiting warming to 2 degrees and the trajectory that we're currently on. So we estimate with current policies as we actually have them, as well as our assumptions of how they might progress in the coming years, our business as usual estimate implies 3.6 degrees warming by end of century over pre-industrial levels, so far exceeding the target. Now, of course, other modeling groups have other estimates. There's differences about assumptions, but that message is quite robust in the literature. We're not there with the policies we have in the books, right? We also consider an extension of the Paris Agreement. So this is the 2015 agreement in Paris, where countries agreed that we should ideally limit warming to 2 degrees or below. And countries have been pledging so-called nationally determined contributions of what they intend to do with their emissions. If we assume all those ambitions are met and that the agreement is extended after 2030 at some rate that we assume, that will help, but it's still going to fall short of the 2-degree target and even falls short of sort of a very cost-benefit maximizing optimal scenario. Right, so we're really far from where we ought to be, either for 2 degrees or just from an average cost-benefit perspective. That's the first core message. The other core message is that this version of DICE, compared to the previous version, has a substantially larger estimate of the social cost of carbon. And I think, Thomas, this is what you were alluding to earlier, is the overall economic impact of climate change. The social cost of carbon tells us 1 ton of carbon that I emit today, the present value of the damages it's going to cause around the world for the next hundreds of years to society, right? How much damage am I causing the world? This is the size of my externality in strict economics terms. An economist, very famous economist, Michael Greenstone, often calls it the most important number you've never heard of. Except now I think more and more people have. So our estimates imply a much larger social cost of carbon than previous versions of DICE. Now, our number for now, I think it's about $85 a ton for right now, is low compared to some other recent numbers that have been influential or that the US government has chosen for the social cost of carbon. But I think the third finding, and I would highlight, is that those differences come down in a way to different assumptions about discounting. So how much should we be willing to pay today to avoid $1 of climate damages in 10 years? Reasonable people can disagree about that, conceptually how to think about that problem. And so when we adjust more or less for the discounting assumptions made by some other modeling groups and the US government, then our social cost of carbon estimates actually align perfectly. So the discounting question is a complicated, thorny one. Many brilliant scholars have debated this for decades. That's something we need to continue to think and talk about as a society. But certainly I'm excited about the progress we've made in updating the model and the results we find for the social cost of carbon and the work we have to do.
Great. That's a great summary, I think. So I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately. So thank you for being with us today, Professor Lint Barrage. It's been great to talk to you. For anyone interested in digging into more detailed Lint's work, all of it's available on her website. So feel free to check that out. And so this has been a UCLA Anderson Forecast podcast. As I mentioned before, the goal here is to bring some of the interesting research being done in academic economics and finance to the broader public. And so thank you for listening.